My name is Bastian Greshake Tzovaras, and I'm currently working as an independent researcher, a freelance researcher on different research projects. And my background is I used to be a biologist and bioinformatician, so I did a PhD in bioinformatics, but already during my master's, I started being interested in participatory and citizen science and worked a lot on getting people to both like make use of their own data and like share this data for research purposes, and have been working in this area for a long time, and have done like after my PhD worked like in different research institutes on like participatory science, and yeah, now I'm doing it independently. So I was like more or less traditionally in research institutes as a postdoc and as a team leader following my PhD in different ways. So first I was like a research fellow in like a lab in the US for a while, working with like a nonprofit organization, and then was a team lead in a research institute in France, and then became like a senior researcher in a research institute in the UK. And at some point, I think I, for myself, recognized a bit that like, for the type of research that I'm doing, like, maybe like the more traditional research institutes were not a great fit, both like in terms of like the structure of it, which like participatory science doesn't still fit in so well, but also that it's a type of research that doesn't need a whole lot of funding compared to like many traditional life sciences, so that it's the type of research you can actually do with communities quite easily independently, like working with like different groups of people, as the main thing you need is the funding for your own time in a way, and not so much for like resources and consumables and things like this. So that's how I ended up becoming someone who like works more like on a consulting, like individual, like contributing to research projects basis independently. So currently, for example, I work with the Citizens and Technology Lab of Cornell University as an external consultant on their participatory research projects. So it's also a way to get in to work in lots of different fields and like do a lot of interesting research in different areas. The problem is that like the traditional research institutions like tend to like move quite slow and like have like in terms of hiring people and of like finding funding, it's very hard. And many, I think, research projects can benefit from whether it's open science or participatory science expertise on a more short-term basis, which maybe is not so easy to achieve for institutions in their traditional frameworks, where like hiring an expertise externally and like getting this expertise from outside into research groups can be really useful. And I think that's like both for like, yeah, participatory science and open science, where like currently, like it's very hit and miss which research groups, even not institutions, have like expertise based on whether there's postdocs, PhD students, or even the PI themselves who has an interest in open science. And like some groups are doing really well and some aren't. And I think like getting external people in can be a way to like get this like kickstarted in groups which maybe aren't yet. Like having lots of expertise in-house to like train people and get them like to understand a bit the benefits and how to do it. I think especially yeah for like the data science bit, I think that's another thing where like we like coming from like a bioinformatics background, that's something I feel like a lot of like more traditional biology research also really like struggles with, and like trying to like use maybe more like modern or advanced like data analysis tools, which then the people like don't are not too familiar with yet, and like don't know the limitations and how to appropriately use them. And there's a reason why it's its own research field in itself. So like it's good to like collaborate and make interdisciplinary research groups. And if external people can be a way to get this interdisciplinarity into groups, that's really great. So yeah, like these two projects that you mentioned, like have like a slightly different way in which like we governed them or still govern them. So like OpenSNP is like a research project we ran for around 11 years, as like an online platform for people to donate their personal genomes into the public domain. And this was very much just governed or like maybe more administered from like a technology perspective by me and a couple of friends who like did this as like a small like side project in a way. And there was very little, in a way, participatory governance from the data donors because the data like was just put out in the public domain for anyone to use. So there was like a one-time decision to say this data should be out there for anyone to use, no strings attached. And for that reason, there was not as much of a need to like negotiate governance going forward. And that was when we started this project back in 2011, quite intentional to say, as we are doing this like as like a little hobby project, we don't have the capacities and like the time to actually like maybe have like a more advanced like setup for this. So let's do the most simple thing, which will probably be quite radical and like many people will not feel comfortable donating data under this model. But at the same time, the people who do feel comfortable, like they are having now a way to do so and like to grow this type of data out there for anyone to use, which otherwise would not exist. So that was like the one like quite radical, like intentional decision to say we are doing it like this. And Open Humans works quite different in the sense that first of all, it's like it's its own nonprofit organization that's like based in the United States. So there's like a lot of like oversight and like governance on that level already, just like also on a level of like there's funding coming in, or there's funding to like run these things, and but currently it's all also run by volunteers, but for like a good while there was like paid staff to like do a lot of these things. And based on that, it was also about people not putting their data necessarily out publicly for anyone, but like brokering sharing of data between people who have data and research projects that want to use the data. And for that reason, there was like quite a bit of like participatory governance involved as well, both like on like the individual project level. If a project was on the platform, individuals could decide to join a project and donate their data to a specific cause. And the researchers that wanted to like receive donations needed to outline what their research project is, what their objectives are, like how they will use the data, how they will store it. So to give people an idea of what will happen with their data and for what purpose. And interestingly, very much like in line with what the European GDPR, the data privacy rules, like would like years later like introduce in like the on a legal level in Europe, like Open Humans like had the same approach for like giving people a way to understand their data to make an informed decision to donate data already a bit before. So that's like on the per project level, but then also like in terms of governance, we introduced a way for like community approval of projects themselves. So if researchers wanted to ask for data donations, before they could even do so, they needed to get the approval of the community to say, this is what we want to do. And do you think this is like a reasonable way to do this? Is this a valid research question? Do you think that we are like that this is a good way to like store the data and so on? And it was like very much like in a discursive mode. So people would like make their proposal and then people would like actually give feedback and say, I think like you need to like change this thing or like this that thing. In extreme cases, people like the researchers had like their like software code for like storing the data open source. So people looked even at the code and said, I think there's like an issue here that you should be fixing. So a quite like broad range of feedback. And ultimately, like on a level of consensus, like people negotiated this until everyone was happy and said, okay, there's no more objections. Like a fun little example that comes to mind is someone wanted to like do a research study on the Myers-Briggs personality types, which are these like depending on whom you ask, pseudoscience or not, like personality types. And like some people felt quite strongly that this was not real science and that like looking into genetic associations would not yield anything. And at the same time, like after the discussion, like everyone agreed that even if like it's not, they will likely not find anything because these personality types don't are not valid, like from a psychological level. It's interesting to allow them to do the study as like a community project to like show that there is no connection. So that's like a fun little like example of that. And as like on the last level in terms of governance, inspired by how the Wikimedia Foundation is doing it, how like their board members are at least partially elected by the contributor community of editors to Wikimedia projects like Wikipedia, Wikimedia Commons, and so on. Open Humans also had like a third of the board seats elected by the community. So if you had an account and you contributed, you were like regularly asked to like elect some of the members of the board of the nonprofit organization to be involved as well. So that's like a very different level of like engagement and yeah, joint governance there. Yeah, I think so. When we started OpenSnip in 2011, I think like we always felt like strongly about like also making people aware of like the potential risks of donating their genetic data into the public domain. So we wrote these like since the beginning, I always said they were human readable, not lawyer readable, like terms of service which like said if you donate your genetic data into the public domain, this data can be used by law enforcement, by insurance companies, by your employer, so they might not hire you because of some genetic association. They might like not insure you any longer. Law enforcement might use this data against you in some way, like, and whether that's valid or not, like it might even like be like a different question. And even if your data today to you looks fine, like the whole point is to enable further research. So like you think you are healthy and there's no like problematic data in your genome as of today, maybe tomorrow someone publishes a new study that finds horrible things about you. And all of a sudden this data is very sensitive. And I think for a longer while, like the risk benefit like considerations were quite different because on the one hand, like the data, like for many years, like did have realistically quite limited value. So I think like when we started, like it was like a bit the hype of like the personal genomes, and like now like we do just genome-wide association studies, and we will learn so many things. And quite similar to the Human Genome Project, in the end, it turned out we didn't learn so many things from like a biomedical perspective. Like the on that level, the data had like very limited utility. And while we did like make some interesting studies that like people used this data for and found some interesting things, like there was not like a big breakthrough like on this level. So the benefit was comparatively limited. And then over the years, I think there was always like where this data ended up having the most impact was like in indeed law enforcement use, where like there was this famous case of like the Golden State Killer in California that was like found because like some like relative was like in the public DNA database for ancestry data. And this like use of data like kept growing in a way. And then between that use and seeing the like maybe right-wing extremism that we see like in like on a political level in many places, including the US, where many of the users came from, because that's the largest like cohort of like customers of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, we thought that like now it becomes really problematic also in the sense that like these things are getting more and more detached from real science, where people make big claims about what can be done with this data. And like there was like this like let's start like have like databases of autistic people like in the US like came up as a thing, and it's like, do we want to like contribute our data to being abused to this? And like, I mean, our data, but the data that we are hosting becomes now like a big risk potentially that someone runs with it and makes whatever big claims. And for that reason, we thought like at this point, the risk of this data being abused like definitely outweighs the comparatively limited impact. And like let's make sure to not like as much as we at least can do by just removing the data from our hands to like not like contribute this, especially as we were still accepting new donations. So people were still donating data. So to at least say, let's not like give more people enough rope to hang themselves in a way, because by now we think like this is more dangerous than we thought like the 11 years earlier when we started. We like sent out an email before like we shut everything down, like I think a month before more or less, and said like, okay, we decided to do this step. If you want to download your own genetic data again or anything else like from your own data, now is the time to do so. And here are the reasons why. And we got quite a lot of people like responding to this email and all very positively. So I think like a lot of people were like, it's a shame that like the state of the world is such that this is like a step you think is like the right thing to take. But also we do agree and like we think it's very like admirable and like it's a good thing that you decide to like have this integrity in a sense to go ahead and say like we've changed our mind, which like I think maybe like is often not as easy to do to say like okay like maybe what we decided like back in 2011 in 2025 like is not the right thing anymore and like we've changed our mind. It's not so easy to do, and I think it was really nice to see that many people appreciated to say that like okay like that's the right step to do, and also to say that like we like no one was like angry for like losing the data resource or like nearly no one. I think there was like one or two researchers that used this data, and at least one of them like definitely felt like from the response we got that they were doing research that was exactly the type of reason we were shutting down the project. So it was like, okay, like if anything, that's like just like giving us a good excuse to like indeed go through with it. But also like no one felt that like we had tricked them into like donating their data. It's like I think everyone understood that the world had changed and we had like I think we were like having done our best back when we started the project and thinking we were doing the right thing and then like changing along with the world. So I think no one was like angry also from that perspective, which was really nice to see. Like I think of course it also depends a bit like on the type of data you are thinking about, but I think we've seen now like again and again that like data, if it's about people and even if people like think very hard about how the data is stored and how it's being accessed and how you share it with other people, that it's very, very hard to do that in a way that is responsible and ethical and in a way also stays that way in the future. So the example of the UK Biobank, I think like many like very smart people like did their best to like make sure that UK Biobank as like a national like UK-wide project is like following the best practices and keeps the data safe. But then there's so many like moving parts that make it very, very hard to keep the data this way. There was like a similar example of like researchers accidentally leaking the data along with their code on GitHub also just a few weeks ago. And like it's again a thing that like people want to do open science and they want to share the data and they want to share their code. And then it's an unintended consequence, which I think like partially, of course, it's a matter of like, okay, maybe these people didn't get like the training they needed to do so in a responsible way, but I think there will always be some mismatch between how well you can train people and like new technology for sharing data, for making use of the data, which makes it really, really hard for like the this data never to like end up in these situations. And I think to me, having now worked a lot in participatory research and participatory data governance, I think that's really one big aspect to maybe not minimize the risk, but at least make sure that like the people you collect the data about are involved in this decision making. And it's like maybe on the one hand, it's a bit of like cover your own ass to say, well, if the people are involved, then at least like everyone is jointly responsible. So it like it dilutes a bit like the researcher being all by themselves like responsible. But also I think often it shows like that like where like the people that you collect data about concerns might be quite different to the concerns researchers have. So an example is like a couple of years ago, we did a research project with a community of autistic people, and they like had very strong concerns about like not the data use necessarily as much, but also who contributes data, because it was about qualitative data, and they were very concerned that like the data set would not only represent their own perspective, but that parents of autistic children would like chime in as well, which would like provide a very different viewpoint and one that's like from like a like political perspective in a sense like between autistic people is viewed quite differently and quite problematically. So that's again like a thing that maybe we as like a research team or like the research team initially had not thought about that much, which like came as a bit of a surprise. And because the people were involved from the start in like designing the data collection mechanisms, like we could account for and say, okay, then we make sure that like this project, like both like from a scientific validity becomes better, but also from like a moral and ethical perspective to say we are not doing harm to the community that we want to work with. So I think like if one has the option to like engage like with people like early on, that's really powerful and really useful. And I know that like at least in the UK, like there's like a strong like patient engagement and involvement like background, but like in many other countries, I think that doesn't exist yet. And also even there, I would say it's often quite perfunctory of like how this is being done, of like consulting people very like superficially. And I think if one can engage very deeply with communities, that really makes a big difference. I think like what helped or can help a lot is to just really like before like trying to like involve more deeply is to just like be like join like these like different communities, whether that's a patient community or whatever, and just be like I don't want to say fly on the wall because it feels like quite like surveillance-y, but like to be there and listen. I think just to like get a sense of like what people's concerns are and like take these seriously and like respectfully listen and maybe ask questions and like understand like these community perspectives is I think the most important first part to really like design research projects maybe differently and improve them and then going back. But I think like a lot is really building this rapport and say like don't be like a helicopter like researcher, just like drop in and like say now I want to extract knowledge from you. Like I think that's like one risk that often happens of like, oh, so there are people that can help me and then you just like want to extract, but it needs to be like a fair like exchange. Like I think that's the other important thing, and that can be quite hard to do depending on the research question, of course, and the community in question, because often I think people have very big like and legitimate concerns about research, how it's being done in the past on like a patient community, for example, or maybe also how the medical system in a given country is maybe not providing the services they would actually need. And often I think it can be really hard for like from a researcher perspective as well to say like I take this seriously, but also like to understand and acknowledge the limitations of like as a researcher, you are not in charge of like the like national healthcare system. There's only so much you can do, and like to be open, honest about that as well. I think is really important to say these are things I can realistically do as a researcher, which is hopefully find new knowledge which helps you somewhere in the future. But and even that's very like tentative because like you never know what you find in research. That's the whole point. So I think that's like a big challenge. The problem, of course, with all of this is like it's in a way extremely hard to do given the current limitations in which all researchers in traditional institutions operate. There's like people need to publish a lot, people spend like half of their time trying to apply for money somewhere. So asking people to do even more is really hard. And to say now you should go and like go once a week to like a patient meeting in your town to like talk to people is like an unrealistic expectation for me, many people to set up, I think, given like all of these constraints. And I think maybe like not on like an individual like researcher level, but I think it really needs this like change towards like maybe a bit more slower science to like allowing people to really take this time. Because I think what we see today is like there's a lot of like research being published and more and faster and faster. But we don't see that it's actually more impactful. I think we just see people trying their best to stay ahead of like the the game to somehow stay competitive and stay being able to like get their next postdoc position, maybe find like a permanent research position somewhere, like get their next grant. And it doesn't really allow to deeply engage both with like the communities, which I think is really important, but even just with the research like topics themselves. I think it's becoming harder and harder for people to find the time. And I think that's maybe the root cause where we really need to like change how like institutional like data production happens. So I'm a big AI hater and skeptic. That's s- especially when it comes to citizen science communities. I think we see how like people are implementing these like AI tools in a way that's actually quite harmful to the participant communities. Like one big example in the citizen science world was last year, like the iNaturalist platform where people submit observations from nature and then they are being like classified and like identified by other volunteers. Got like a grant by Google to implement some like whatever like latest AI tools that Google was making. And like large parts of the community were quite like unhappy with this, both because it's a community of people that care strongly about nature and like all the negative environmental impacts of AI, like felt like people could not square how can we be like a conservation like thing that like should be related to conversation and now we are boiling the ocean to like somehow like classify these images more quickly. And also I think there was like a sense of like a disconnect, and I think this goes a bit back to the governance that like what like the organization that runs iNaturalist things their mission is and like what they want to do, which is like somehow provide a big data set of observations about nature, which like all the volunteers who contribute to iNaturalist also have this as like a goal or a motivation. But they also want to learn, they also want to interact with other people, and there's like a lot of secondary motivations of like what makes iNaturalist as a community effort what it is today. And like understandably to me, like people were very upset that now like these interactions were supposed to be replaced by talking to a chatbot in some sense of like you used to talk to people about like negotiating what like an observation could be and like how to identify this plant or animal. And now a chatbot was supposed to tell you, and people like felt that this was like draining out like this like human connection that they thought was part of it as well. And I think this is not unique to iNaturalist. I think like there is a risk that like these like tools remove like the aspects that actually make like citizen science and also in a sense open science work and any science, because all of this is like at the end of the day science is like a social endeavor which like lives from people working with each other and interacting. And that if we are drowning out like this by like some like tools which pretend to be human somehow, like it's really problematic. So that's one like reason to be to me very skeptical of this. And the other I think is that we people say, but it works well for like easy tasks. But the problem, of course, is that like even if this were true, which I also am not like convinced of, but like there's a reason why like especially for researchers like all your life becomes effectively training and learning, and that's because like you need to do these easy things first before you can like engage more deeply with the topic. There's a reason why like research is structured as like a effectively lifelong mentorship, because only by first learning to walk you can at some point run. And I think there's a real risk that like this like takes away the tasks that you need to actually learn to have more complex interactions in research. And the same is true in the citizen science world. Like if like the volunteers they like become very proficient at doing things because they start out doing very simple things and then they like become very like proficient and become maybe a world expert in like a particular type of like identifying beetles, but only because you didn't take away all the easy tasks for them in the beginning. So I think that's another real risk I see there, and which makes me like quite concerned about the state of how science is developing currently. I see the same in like the all the open source communities where now it's like, oh, but like now like all the simple tool, like all the simple like coding tasks can be done by the AI, which is very nice, but how do you think the next maintainer generation will grow and help you once you retire once? If like these people never like learned like their actual craft, so it becomes this barrier where there's like a big chasm basically between like where people are that who want to learn, and then like you can either stay on like this very basic level of prompting an AI, or you are already an expert, but there's no pathway any longer to upskill. I will, like, for the foreseeable future at least, continue working on a research project, particularly about actually like this question about AI and algorithmic interactions in online communities, which is a project we are currently doing at the Citizens and Technology Lab at Cornell, which like, yeah, we are looking into how like the ecology of online communities and how like the ecology of contributors and how people work together changes either because there's algorithmic recommendations. If you think of like traditional social media platforms, which increasingly are just like showing you whatever the algorithms thinks, but also when it comes to, yeah, the use of AI, when like people think that their community is being taken over or undermined by people contributing using AI tools, and how like exactly those effects effectively, like does this like cut off like a pathway for newcomers, or like does this lead to an imbalance between the capacity of a community to welcome newcomers if all of a sudden, because AI makes it easier to contribute in some way, like it overwhelms the like community elders who are moderating and making sure that people are welcomed. So, for example, in Wikipedia, we've seen that I think the English and German language Wikipedia have banned the use of AI because the like seasoned editors cannot actually like put in enough time to review all of these things that people submit. So they say, no, it needs to be human written because otherwise there's no way to keep the quality standard up that we expect from Wikipedia. And it's those questions where I think it will be very interesting. We want to like work with communities to model these interactions in their communities and like really co-design research questions with these communities to say, so what's the challenges you are currently facing, whether that's in your subreddit or in your language edition of Wikipedia? And are there maybe early warning systems we can design to like help you understand when like the community is at risk somehow of like these imbalances? So that's like one project that like I'm working on currently, and otherwise locally here in Argentina we are currently like designing a couple of like workshops on participatory mapping with like local communities to help them to like understand like on a very localized like level like where they are living and like what their needs are, and to better understand using mapping as like the data collection technology for that. So that's like on a very different like level like two things that are currently ongoing.